Welcome to Philosophy of Value Workshops number 6 of Series 7. The question this evening is, does Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape, flout Hume's is-ought distinction? Reading from one of my works, The Pursuit of Value, Chapter 4, Section 3. So the last couple of weeks we have been talking about how value has been neglected in various contexts. This neglect is important because I take value to be crucial to resolving questions of human existence. That is, in my view, value can provide an objective and principle of life in the pursuit of value. I have expressed the idea many times that principles of ethics are values that guide moral behaviour, and I have said that a neglect of value leads to a neglect and a misunderstanding of principles of ethics. Today I argue that such a misunderstanding is evident in Harris's book The Moral Landscape. This book was published over 10 years ago but still has some important lessons for us now. The book shows how intelligent people can be very mistaken if they aren't properly informed or well intentioned. It shows the importance of being informed by crucial ideas that can't be compensated by sheer intelligence. We can see this in the serious errors made by geniuses like Plato, Aristotle, Descartes and Newton. But more relevantly here, the moral landscape reveals a neglect of both value and basic principles of ethics. That is, a book entitled The Moral Landscape must include its major features, but Harris leaves these out. He doesn't refer to the work of Aristotle, Kant or Hume, but only looks to science for answers. Moreover, Harris insists on developing a rational understanding of human well-being. Immanuel Kant presents perhaps the most elaborate attempt to establish a rational understanding of ethics. But Harris neither discusses Kant or the problems that Kant faced in this endeavour. Among the many critiques of Harris's work are John Horgan, Nathan Robinson, Thomas Nagel, Troy Jollimore, Anthony Appiah and Russell Blackford. Colin McGinn writes that there are just some really bad thinking in Sam Harris's new book. It sounds terrible and wrong-headed and just bizarre. He's trying to make science do what religion used to. The idea is wrong, it's been refuted, it's hard to believe they still argue that point, unquote. Yet to make the point, we should begin an analysis with a brief summary of Harris's book in 3 points. 1. Morality is all about improving the well-being of conscious creatures. 2. Facts about the well-being of conscious creatures are accessible to science. 3. Therefore science can tell us what's objectively moral as an increase or decrease in well-being. Underpinning this argument is Harris's claim that science can determine human values. But this is hugely controversial and would have to overcome many problems such as Hume's is-ought distinction, More's naturalistic fallacy and Mackie's case against objective values. Yet there are many other problems like moral conflict, human relations and human choice. One issue is about what Harris's claim means. Does it mean that science can answer and determine ethical questions rather than inform them. If he's saying science can inform ethical questions, then not many of us would disagree. For example, science can tell us whether smoking is harmful, and that bears upon whether we should encourage smoking. But it doesn't determine whether we should encourage smoking or not. But Harris insists that only science can help us answer the questions of meaning, morals, and life's larger purpose. And Harris also presents his view as a bold new claim of determining human values with science. But many others have attempted and failed to make similar arguments from science. For example, in the 70s, the sociobiologist Edward O. Wilson claimed that, I quote, "Science may be soon in a position to investigate the very origin and the meaning of human values." But Wilson has since admitted to not being able to show the obligatory force of values beyond their social or psychological consequences. Harris is faced with the same problem. But in order to bolster his position, Harris makes a further startling claim, that the separation between science and human values is an illusion. For Harris, this follows from his definition of good as well-being that can be determined by science. And he defines bad as the worst possible misery for everyone as a factual state that is indisputably bad. And as science is able to facilitate well-being and mitigate misery, science and moral values are inextricably linked. That is, science can address values by identifying the ways in which values flow from the objectively good or bad experiences of conscious creatures. There are a lot of issues that we need to address here. Some of them follow from his view of the good as well-being. One of them is that we should distinguish between good as undesirable from the moral good. Yet moving on, Harris says that we should maximise the global well-being of conscious creatures. That is, he presents well-being as a utilitarian outcome which incurs the problems of utilitarianism. One such problem for Harris is that he gives no explanation of why individuals should act for the well-being of others. He seems to assume, yet more culpably than Kantians, utilitarians or virtue theorists, that rational people or those of good character will act in the way required of them. But Harris doesn't explain how injunctions are binding on us if we don't accept them. Harris similarly, as just noted, has an idiosyncratic way of establishing moral facts. That is, of establishing moral facts directly from conscious experience, without subjecting them to intervening moral assessment. This view might be intuitively compelling in such cases of acute pain, but it is nevertheless philosophically naive. He explains that it's only worth discussing the well-being of conscious beings which can experience something. This is true, but the value of its well-being is still subject to different moral assessments. Another problem with utilitarian happiness, or Harris's well-being, is how do we both scale and measure it. Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum have researched the problem of well-being, but Harris mentions neither. The idea of maximization and the problems of motivation and measuring well-being are common to utilitarianism. But in these respects, utilitarian happiness may be less problematic than that of well-being. In addition to the problems above, there is also the problem of the definition and vagueness of well-being. In response to the problems of definition, vagueness and measurement of well-being, Harris makes a comparison. He likens well-being to health or physical health, and like health, well-being resists precise definition. Now, resistance to definition does not invalidate the idea of health or the idea of well-being. But in the case of well-being, the broad definition of well-being hides errors that can't be hidden in health. That is, health primarily deals with empirical and pragmatic issues that are in principle open to view. But well-being is an ethical construct with debatable issues. Yet this seems to be exactly what Harris seeks to avoid in his recourse to science. But in a recourse to science and to facts, we must discuss the even more pressing problem of value. To do that, we should first consider some of the ways that science can and cannot determine human values. The default distinction here is between human values and scientific facts, and the basic argument is about the relation between facts and values. Yet we must be mindful that the fact-value distinction isn't the same as the more powerful is-ought distinction. This is illustrated by considering ways in which science might well be able to determine human values. One way that science might determine values is by offering attractive options that people choose to value. But this process does not provide moral imperatives that always motivate people to action. Another way that science might determine values is by revealing the social and biological forces that act upon people. But again, social and biological forces are subject to the naturalistic fallacy and don't carry moral compulsion. Another way that science might determine values is by showing the value-laden nature of science. That is, as Hilary Putnam argued, facts and values cannot be completely disentangled. Or, in another way, Thomas Kuhn has shown science to be subject to social influences. Or, the practice of science involves choices, preference and values about what we focus upon. Or that science assumes values such as coherence, reasonableness and simplicity. Another philosophical rather than scientific argument is that consciousness brings values into the world. But again, much work needs to be done here before these can be translated into moral values. And this is nothing like the kind of argument that Harris is making. These are all different ways in which science might determine values, but none of them provide moral or strong motivational values. Yet considering them shows possible mistakes and difficulties of obtaining values from science. Yet another source of values is values produced by pain, pleasure and the needs of survival. These are the kinds of values Harris is appealing to, and we will consider such shortly. Yet we first need to consider general principles of Moore and Hume that Harris doesn't consider. To recap, Harris claims that scientific methods and facts can determine human and moral values. But against this view stands Hume's law and Moore's naturalistic fallacy. Hume's law is that a prescriptive ought cannot be deduced from a factual is, or that morals can't be derived from reason. This is also called the is-ought distinction. More's naturalistic fallacy further precludes deriving values from the factual or the non-conscious world, and More claimed that such oversight could be found in practically every ethical theory. So, unsurprisingly, like much of science, Harris ignores the problem, and other scientists who ignore the problem are the noted Edward O. Wilson, Michael Shermer, Lawrence Krauss, and Stephen Hawking. But Hume's law or principle has never been unseated. This is despite continuous challenges by such as Iris Murdoch, A.N. Pryor, and John Searle. And Hume's law has been thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. Examples of both Hume's and More's principles can be taken from human life. For example, the fact that men have always been the dominant gender doesn't mean that they ought to be taken as such. Or the fact that gay people can't reproduce naturally doesn't mean that they ought not to adopt children. More's naturalistic fallacy further exposes a confusion between moral values and natural states like pleasant. Support this view, More gives his open question argument that we can illustrate shortly. Because Harris, as well as ourselves, are making philosophical claims, we need to present arguments, not just make assertions. So I will briefly outline 4 arguments in support of Hume. One argument supporting Hume is that he finds a previously unrecognised relation to be accounted for. In his 1740 treatise, Hume writes that in every system of morality which I have hitherto met with, I am surprised to find that instead of is and is not, I meet with an ought or an ought not. That is, a moral value is being surreptitiously smuggled into the equation by sleight of hand. We can also note the generality of the problem indicating a neglect of moral value. 2. Another argument for the is-ought constraint can be taken from the tautologous character of logic. That is, nothing can be in a conclusion that isn't contained within its premises, neither properties or values. For example, given 10 rooms with 10 chairs in each room, therefore we have 100 chairs, not 100 red chairs or 100 value chairs in all the rooms. And 3, an argument from reason and reasonableness is that we can appeal to moral intuition to override dogma. That is, dictates of logic, universalization or nature should not override human judgment. For example, human judgment should override natural law like the survival of the fittest. And 4, finally, belief in freedom and choice means that I can assert my own values over dictates and injunctions. This isn't incoherent, but relegating the significance of logical consequences, or of God's will or genetics. For example, if I do X, I will go to hell, but I'd rather go to hell in freedom than be a slave in heaven. The outcome is that scientific facts about such state as misery cannot in themselves determine moral values. That is, however intuitively compelling, such require another value judgment in order to render them moral. And as noted, a revealed fact such as the worst misery for all can be superseded by some other value. And without a further value judgment, scientific facts can only add to More's open questions. More's open question argument is that identification of morality with any natural properties will always be an open question, because it can never be settled whether they are morally relevant or not. Yet Harris's attempt to equate moral values with facts has problems that go beyond those of Hume and More. There is a tradition of moral facts and ethical realism rejected by many, such as Bernard Williams. John Mackey's error theory also argues against objective values that Harris seems to imply. That is, the view that science determines moral values implies objective values in the world. In response, Harris accuses Mackey of conflating two notions of objectivity and subjectivity. But Mackey makes no such error. Mackey's point is that there are no objective values as ontological entities in the fabric of the world. Mackey isn't talking about universal values or their prescriptive power. Yet Harris has set up his moral parameters of good and bad as well-being and the worst possible misery for everyone. And Harris posits the worst possible misery for everyone as a factual state that is indisputably bad. So everything which moves away from that is good, and everything that moves towards it is bad. An initial problem here is that well-being and misery, as good and bad, need not be moral problems. They could be medical, psychological, social, political, or economic problems rather than moral problems, and that these are considered moral or moral activities depends upon a moral judgment. This is a further difficulty of equating scientific facts with moral values. Yet there are several problems with the worst possible misery for everyone as indisputably or inescapably bad. One is that it may not be indisputably or inescapably bad. There may be things that are worse, such as betraying my friends, denying the truth, being intentionally immoral, not doing God's will, etc., etc. Therefore, the worst possible misery for everyone doesn't do what it is supposed to, that it doesn't act as an ultimate moral backstop that contains the idea of ethics. Secondly, the worst misery may well be bad, but the idea of bad is already contained in the idea of the worst misery. Harris could also say that the worst bad is bad, or bad is bad, which is an empty tautology. For example, we could say stealing is wrong, but the idea of wrongness is already contained in the idea of stealing. Reframing the idea as taking the things that do not belong to you produces different results. And thirdly, Harris wants the worst misery to mean every possible bad. But the definition of the worst misery as every possible bad is already a philosophical problem. This is because the idea of indisputably or inescapably bad sets a standard that cannot be disproven. That is, the indisputably or inescapably bad already discounts any possible exceptions. And as Popper and others hold, the unprovable is neither philosophy or science. So in Harris's view, everything that moves away from worst misery increases well-being and is good. But the worst misery and well-being are woefully inadequate as moral criteria. That is, there are so many things that the notions of worst misery and well-being don't account for. They don't tell us about crucial things like why we should value other people and to what extent should I respect other people's values over my own. We also need a theory of motivation and a way of resolving moral conflicts. We need to quantify and compare states like happiness, moral integrity and hope. And more generally, how am I to act in particular cases and how am I to live? The idea of well-being isn't able to answer these questions as ethics must. Yet we need to say that Harris' ethics of well-being shares many of the problems of other theories of ethics. Modern theories of ethics largely focus on limited questions of what is moral and how must I act. Yet as in classical theories, ethics needs to cover a lot more things within human experience, like meaning, purpose, intention, aesthetic experience, belief, hope, doubt and anxiety. Or as in Aristotelian ethics, the good life and human flourishing. But a really adequate explanation of why we should value other people isn't found in any theory of ethics. We might accept that other people have intrinsic value, but we still have to find some reason to accept their intrinsic value into our own value system. Harris doesn't seem to appreciate this idea. But many thinkers agree with Harris' rejection of moral relativity, yet they think he does so for the wrong reasons. That is, compelling intuitions of injustice, unacceptable outcomes, and moral facts derived from science. He nevertheless convincingly states that the most basic facts about human flourishing must transcend culture, and that, for example, the beliefs of the Taliban are incompatible with human flourishing. That is, they encourage suicide bombing, compulsory veiling and genital mutilation, as well as denying women education and punishing people with beatings, acid or death. Blackford states that Harris reaches these conclusions about moral relativism only by offering what strikes me as highly implausible and ultimately unsustainable account of the phenomenon of morality. Blackford explains that the problem lies in his insistence that moral judgments are straightforwardly and determinately true or false in the same way as factual statements. In a future workshop, I will discuss Ronald Dworkin, who has a similar view. Yet Harris goes on to rightly emphasize the dangers of defending detrimental cultural practices. We can find examples in slavery, the castration of eunuchs, and punishment by amputation. But imposing moral values on past or distant cultures is a difficult undertaking. For example, in the New Testament, Paul exhorts slaves be obedient to your human masters. That is in Ephesians 6:5-8 and other places. But Harris unfairly contrasts moral relativism with moral realism as the only way forward. As indicated here, moral realism is a contentious position rejected by Mackey, Williams and many others, including myself. Moral facts, value realism and an ethics derived from science is only one option. There are many other ways of countering moral relativity apart from moral realism. I have presented some of these in my workshops. So we can conclude by not only rejecting Harris's ethic of well-being, but also the thinking it stands on. That is, the view that science or scientific facts can determine human or moral values. Yet more than that, Harris' book shows how intelligent people can be mistaken if they aren't properly informed. And in this case, this includes a neglect of Hume and More, which indicates error and also a neglect of value. The maximisation of well-being and other similarities led to many criticisms that are levelled against utilitarianism, such as a failure to explain why individuals should act for the well-being of others. Another problem is how to either scale or measure happiness or well-being. The idea of maximisation is also problematic as a property of qualitative moral values. Similarly, the ideal of well-being as a moral value leaves so much out. It leaves out meaning, purpose and aesthetic experience, as well as doubt, anxiety and moral conflict. We can also add Aristotelian ethics, character and the good life of human flourishing. But like other theories, Harris doesn't provide an adequate explanation of why we should value other people. Yet Harris is different in that he doesn't even consider the question of why we should value other people. And even his critique of moral relativity is grounded on the assumption of values derived from science. But it is in this relation between scientific fact and moral values that Harris could be most severely criticised. Against Harris's main claim stands Hume's law, or the principle, and More's naturalistic fallacy. To reiterate Hume's law is that a prescriptive ought cannot be deduced from a factual is. And Hume's law has never been unseated, and it is thought proven by More's naturalistic fallacy. But Harris ignores these principles and reaches instead for the facts of science. Have we been too harsh on Harris for errors in his bold new claim that science can determine human values? Scholars like Horgan, Robinson, Nagel, Jollimore, Appiah, McGinn and Blackford don't think so. Yet we should be grateful to Harris for underlying the problem of establishing a moral imperative, such as not being established by religion, reason, psychology, biology, sociology or science. And as I have said many times, I myself begin not with these disciplines but with value itself, that is, choosing value as a better alternative than cognition, affect or volition, and that value is a constituent of consciousness that comes into existence with consciousness, and as such it is subject to constraints and conditions that we could call moral. So let me have your criticism and comments at the meeting or on the meetup or YouTube internet pages.